Everyone can see and hear me, Raquel?
Yes.
Okay, I will start then. So thank you for already having introduced us, Raquel, and thank you for taking on the role of moderator today. Much appreciated. Good afternoon, everyone. And yeah, thank you for joining today's webinar. It's a pleasure indeed to see many familiar names from the world of interpreting, maybe also a few names that are new to the field. I would actually also hope that. Now, I realize that most of you already know public service interpreting very well, probably better than I do myself. But since this webinar is open to a wider audience, I'll just take a few brief moments to also explain some basics along the way. Hopefully this way everyone can follow along and also take something useful away from this session. So yeah, Raquel already introduced me. I'm Remco Ruiter and I'm indeed a conference interpreter at the European Commission, DG Interpretation, or SCIC, as many of you may know it. And I should say straight away what I mentioned, that I'm not a PSI specialist by training, but I have been monitoring the field ever since 2017, and over time it really has become an area that I follow quite closely. I'm also an editor for the Knowledge Center on Translation and Interpreting, as Raquel already said. But most relevant for today, I'm the convener of ISO TC 37 SE5 Working Group 4, which is the working group on interpreting and translation, teaching and training programs outside of higher education. That's a very important addition. What the term convener comes down to exactly will hopefully become clear as we go along. So through these activities that I've just mentioned, the European Commission wants to contribute to capacity building in the field of translation and interpreting. And one of the ways we do that is precisely through ISO standardization. So that will be the perspective that I'll be speaking from today. So let's first set the scope briefly for this presentation. We'll be looking at ISO standardization, as I said, and in public service interpreting, or community interpreting. You probably know that those terms are often used interchangeably. And for this talk, I also will be using the definition of PSI as we know it in ISO, which is interpreting that enables people to access services available to society as a whole, and which they would otherwise be unable to access owing to a language barrier. I hope you can see it like this. And that's an important detail, services available to society as a whole, because these are not necessarily limited to state-organized organizations. I just wanted to make that clear. Because across Europe and beyond, countries have a very different administrative traditions. Some focus on formal state regulation, others rely more on market regulation, on self-regulation. And so ISO provides the infrastructure and the tools to support both approaches. So what's the aim of the presentation of today? It's basically twofold. I'd like to demystify somewhat how ISO works, because it can seem a bit opaque from the outside. And second, I would also like to clarify how ISO standards contribute to building quality and trust in public service interpreting and in public services in general. So maybe I'm preaching to the converted, but just very briefly, now that we've set the scene, just to look why PSI matters so much for today's society. PSI is all about situations and settings, obviously, where people, often with a migration background or simply without knowledge of the local language, need access to essential services. So you think of asylum interviews, medical consultations, police contacts and court hearings, settings, communicative events, as we call them, where communication is absolutely crucial. And on this slide, you see a few examples that won't come as a surprise for you, I guess. So at the top left, you see a sign language interpreter in healthcare. At the top right, a sign language interpreter in a school setting. But public service interpreting is obviously also crucial in legal settings, such as courtrooms, police interviews, as I said, where the access to justice depends largely on accurate translation and interpreting. Also in refugee camps, interpreters are often the first link between new arrivals and essential services. Especially during peak migration flows, like in the EU frontline hotspots in countries like Greece or Italy. And in the central bottom image, you see an asylum interview in an EU member state. And I think that's an interesting example to focus on for a second. Here, the interpreter that you see at the rear end of the table will probably have the right language combination, but she doesn't necessarily have a degree at the university level in interpreting. And so the asylum agency or the ministry also doesn't necessarily have its own in-house training scheme. And so they will often rely on external organizations that provide PSI courses. But in many countries, such organizations either don't exist or they are not widely known, or they do want to get started but lack the necessary expertise to do so. And so they could really use some help, for example, in the form of a standard just to help them get off the ground. So yeah, across the EU, approaches really vary enormously. Some countries have strong frameworks for training and quality assurance. Norway is a good, not an EU member state, but Norway is obviously a good example of that, and I'm sure we will hear a lot about that after my presentation from Leonardo. While others rely on volunteers, bilinguals with little or maybe no training at all. And that really creates structural challenges. First of all, a shortage of well-trained interpreters, also a lack of clear and uniform standards, and also problematic practices, like, for example, the use of child interpreters, self-declared interpreters, or simply not offering interpretation at all, which can amount to unequal treatment under the law. So I think it's not hard to see how that can have very real practical consequences. The exclusion from essential services, the breakdown of trust, and even radicalization in extreme cases. And I think that is where ISO comes in. But before I mention ISO, here you see an example of a poster campaign from the Netherlands, which was quite successful, but I will not go into too many details because that's not the topic of today. But I think it's a strong reminder for those who don't speak Dutch, sorry. The poster says, this is a child, not an interpreter. And I think it's a strong reminder that while good intentions are often there, without clear standards and without proper training, people can easily fall into ethically questionable and even harmful practices, such as the use of child interpreters. To ISO now then. The International Organization for Standardization. It was founded in 1947, based in Geneva, and it develops voluntary, consensus-based international standards in virtually every sector that you can think of, from screw threads to zinc alloys, and also to translation and interpreting. The principle behind it is pretty straightforward. The idea is that standards create common reference points, and they help ensure quality, comparability, and accountability. For interpreters and translators, that means clear definitions, minimum quality requirements and recommendations, and also, and that's important, guidance for public authorities and service providers who hire interpreters. Now, of course, countries are by all means free to set stricter rules. ISO standards are certainly not legislation, but they do offer a reliable framework to build on. It's like a nudge in the right direction, if you will. And personally, I believe that having such a clearly defined framework and set of rules is more important now than ever before, especially now that we see the advent of AI, computer-assisted interpreting tools that are emerging. We really, I think, need clarity more than ever before to make clear what interpreting is, but also what it is not. So on this slide, as you've seen, I've highlighted a few keywords that really summarize why standardization matters. I think quality, ISO brings together the expertise and the perspectives from multiple backgrounds and regions in the world, which really leads to a well-rounded and peer-reviewed set of results. Comparability, international standards offer benchmarks, obviously, and that allows you to measure your own practice against the practice of others. And accountability as well. Organizations claiming to comply with ISO standards can indeed be held accountable against a clear set of requirements. And finally, I've also added global relevance, which is quite a central guiding principle within ISO. ISO is global by design, and that really allows for the exchange of good practice across the globe. Now, before looking at ISO structure and how it exactly works, I think it's worth saying a few words also about ISO's legal status and the fee system, because that's an area where I've understood some confusion may still exist. So ISO is a non-profit and a non-governmental organization under a Swiss law. And it's important to emphasize, I think, ISO is not a private company trying to make money. There are fees involved. So the fees you may associate with ISO, for example, when you want to purchase a published standard or when you want to join a working group as an expert, those fees are there to cover the running costs of the Central Secretariat in Geneva, but also to cover the running cost of the national standardization bodies, the NSBs. And they are the ones that host experts. So as an expert, you cannot join ISO directly. You have to go through your national standardization body. And it's important to keep that in mind. ISO itself does not charge individual experts to participate. It's the national standardization bodies that handle those fees at the national level, and each NSB, each national standardization body, has its own policy. Some are membership based, some charge per committee that you wish to join, but many of them will also reduce or even waive fees entirely for certain categories, such as universities, public institutions, or NGOs. And in most cases, you don't even need to be a national of the country in which you would like to join the NSB. So there's really some room for flexibility there, or there is some flexibility that's offered, I should say. So if you are considering getting involved, it's really worth checking your national and even your neighboring countries' NSBs, because there will most likely be very affordable and probably also entirely free options to join. And if you represent an organization, that's another path to join ISO. As a liaison organization that's typically completely free. This is an ISO level mechanism. It surpasses the national standardization bodies. So yeah, it's entirely free typically, as I said. Liaison organizations can't vote during plenary meetings, but they can by all means participate fully in the work, in the discussions, and also influence outcomes. Right. So how does ISO actually work? The work is organized within broad structures that are called technical committees or TCs. There's a TC for almost everything, as I mentioned already. So from tires or rims and valves, as you see here, to textiles, photography, pulleys, and so on. And the committee dealing with language and terminology is ISO TC 37. And as you can see on this slide, TC37 actually is one of the earliest committees in ISO's history. I think we are now at TC 370 already. And its origins go back to the International Federation of Standard Associations, the predecessor of ISO in the 1930s. The work was then interrupted, obviously, by the Second World War, but resumed afterwards, and TC37 was officially reactivated in the 50s. Its original focus was on electrotechnical terminology to develop a common vocabulary for engineers. But over time, it expanded to cover all aspects of language and terminology management. So yeah, it has quite a long and interesting history, and it remains today really the main global hub for language-related standardization. Now, within Technical Committee 37, the work is divided into several subcommittees, the SCs. Subcommittee 5 is the one that deals with translation, interpreting, and related technology. It was created in 2010, so it's still relatively young. It doesn't have the same history as the overarching technical committee, but it's been extremely active over recent years. And as we move even further down the rabbit hole, further down the structure, we come to the level of the actual working group. So this slide gives you an overview of the 5 working groups within SC5 that I've highlighted in the yellow box. So you see working group 1, translation, number 2, interpreting, number 3, facilities and equipment for interpreting services, number 4, interpreting and translation, teaching and training programs, and finally a TCG, which is a terminology coordination group, a very important working group, which is there to make sure that we coordinate terminology, we coordinate the use of definitions, just to make sure that the frogs don't just all jump out of the basket as we go about writing those standards. So those working groups are really the engine room of ISO. That's where the actual drafting and the actual technical discussions take place. And yeah, I could still add that each working group can also have several projects running in parallel at the same time. Here you can see basically the same as on the previous slide, just a clearer overview of SC5 and its various working groups. I am, as I said in the introduction, the convener of Working Group 4, which focuses on interpreting and translation, teaching and training programs, as I said. Convener is somewhat like a chair. It's an elected position with a time-limited mandate. And it's a bit, there's some overlap with being a chair. The convener is more of a neutral facilitator, an honest broker, if you will. What does that mean in practice? It means organizing and chairing meetings, also keeping projects on schedule. There's strict timelines in the ISO infrastructure. It also means mediating between different stakeholders, obviously, maintaining contact with the subcommittee, with other working groups, and obviously also with the ISO Secretariat. Our main current project in Working Group 4 is the conversion of the technical standard for teaching and training programs into a fully fledged international standard. I won't go into the details about the difference between a technical specification and an international standard. That's not the topic of today. But the idea is that we want to elevate it to the level of a fully recognized international standard. So that's work in progress. Now, let's take a look at where these standards can actually be used and also where they could be used in the future. What you see here are first the obvious areas: translation, interpreting, terminology, and obviously education and training in the fields of translation and interpreting. But there are also emerging fields where standards are becoming increasingly relevant. Things like I mentioned before, language engineering, AI-based tools, and other IT-related technologies. So essentially, anywhere language and communication meet professional service delivery, there is a potential for ISO standards to add structure and consistency. And it's important because the language industry is evolving, incredibly fast. We are not just talking anymore, are we, about face-to-face meetings. Today it's remote, it's hybrid. There's sign language as well, obviously. There's machine-assisted interpreting. And so standards provide a way to make sure that all of these developments keep quality and ethics at the core. Then, earlier I mentioned the concepts of quality, comparability, accountability, and global relevance. This slide expands a bit on that. I will keep it brief. Just to highlight a few practical benefits still. Standards bring clarity, they bring consistency, they bring a level playing field globally. They define what good actually means, what good actually looks like. They help ensure fairness across various contexts. And all in all, I think they make the industry stronger, more credible, and also better understood within the field, but also outside of the profession. Then the who actually creates these standards. It's definitely not done in isolation by a few people at a desk in Geneva. It's a genuinely collaborative effort involving a wide range of stakeholders, professional associations, academia, language service providers, companies, practicing translators and interpreters, individuals as well. Earlier, when talking about ISO fees, I mentioned the free option for liaison organizations. So those entities that contribute with expertise without having to pay fees, but also without holding voting rights at the plenary level. And here just a brief overview. So here you can see some of those liaison organizations that are currently involved in SC5. And they're all gathered around the same table. And I think that's quite interesting and also quite a feat, actually. So just a few examples. We see AIC, that you probably all know, the International Association of Conference Interpreters, WOSLI, the World Association of Sign Language Interpreters, EULITA is present, the European Legal Interpreters and Translators Association, EFSLI, the Forum of Sign Language Interpreters, also the European institutions. I represent the Commission, but the European Parliament is there, as well as the Court of Justice of the EU, and FIT, the International Federation of Translators, and the list goes on, TermNet, Infoterm, and also the World Intellectual Property Organization. So it's really a collective brain trust, if you will, of the profession. So different perspectives meet. They sometimes clash a little, but ultimately they converge to shape the future of translation and interpreting. And the fact that all of this happens by consensus, I think, is really key. No single party can dictate the outcome. Everyone has to agree that the final text makes sense globally. That doesn't mean unanimity. It doesn't mean that everyone always has to agree on every single word, but it does mean that there is consensus on the overall result. I'm slowly coming to an end of the presentation, and I promise not to overload you with statistics, just a few to give you a sense of scale. So first, the TC37 level, the overarching committee. It currently has 87 published standards, 26 more on the development, 36 participating members, so these are the voting countries, and 27 observing members, the non-voting members. So it's truly a global network spanning every continent and involving national bodies, large and small. Zooming in then on the subcommittee level, the SC5 level, we currently have 19 published standards, 8 standards currently under development, 35 participating voting countries, and 15 observing members. So that really is a lot of collective expertise, and it's still growing. The number of active experts in the working groups has doubled roughly over the recent years. And I think that goes to show just how dynamic and relevant this area has become. What should you take away from all of this as far as I am concerned? First, public service interpreting matters because it enables equal access to essential services in today's multilingual and hyperdiverse societies. Second, ISO standardization offers practical tools to help ensure interpreting and translation in all their forms are professional, ethical, and consistent of quality. And third, and maybe most importantly, these standards are made by us, by the community. They are not imposed from above. So if you work in this field, whether as a practitioner or a trainer or a researcher or a policymaker, I'd really encourage you to consider joining us at TC37 SE5. As I've mentioned, you can do it through your national standardization bodies, but really browse around for the best option. And if you represent an organization, I think it's best to opt for the liaison partner option, which is free of cost. Of course, you can also reach me if you wanted to reach out through the Knowledge Center on Translation and Interpretation, the KCTI, where we share updates, resources, community discussions. It's also completely free, open to everyone who is interested in these topics. So let's keep the conversation going. Standardization isn't a static process. It's about sharing experiences, learning from one another, and continuously improving how we work and communicate across languages. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions and thoughts. Thank you.